disciplinary research. However, we expand into education or academic training and service. Of course, outreach, and part of a land-grant mission of our university is that. So thinking some new ideas how to do that. So I met with Bruce, with the heads and the directors of our program, and we got some input for the RFP that will be launched hopefully early October. And we hope that teams of faculty, academics, scientists, postdocs, students, graduate students, undergrads will get together and apply for seed grants. These are small amounts of money. 2 grants on $25K, 1 grant at $50K. You have to bring another partner outside Warner. All the PIs have to be at Warner, because I should recognize that the first person when I arrived on my meeting schedule was Ed. He was right there, and I figure we need to make sure that the college embraces the name. And he told me very clearly as he was walking out of the office, he said, I want to make sure that all departments, all centers, all institutes, all labs feel part of Warner College. So this is funding comes from it. Something that John didn't want to touch, and that we don't have to go into that. But I said, you know what? We have the money. He wants to give us more. Let's spend it. How are we going to spend it? Breaking down silos of collaboration. And begin connecting. And probably you already have many examples of those connections, of that collaboration. So transdisciplinarity. In a meeting of 1 hour, talking about transdisciplinarity. And I cannot explain to them. I forward a few papers, and he replied this morning, and he said, interestingly, you know, I'm multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, but I don't think I can deal with transdisciplinarity. It's a really tough thing to do. Because the way I'm going to read what he said, for transdisciplinarity to take hold, it will take a lot of thought and long-term, reliable funding to overcome the structural problems in the academy and government funder science. See? And that's what we're facing. The way you, as faculty or postdocs or students, you are evaluated is within your silo, within your discipline. So when you do that, you have to publish in your own journal, go to your own meetings, and you actually get penalized if you're third or fourth author in a paper when you have a whole team of different disciplines. And I have to change that somehow, at least within Warner. We have to change the view of that. I know Bruce didn't like it when I type on the RFP. Basically, you must leave your own disciplinary ego at home and learn to listen. He said, that's too top down. And when I talked to him about it, he said, now I understand you. Why? Because I told him, you go to a village of fishermen and tell them, stop fishing because you're killing all the fish. But they come to you and they say, well, I've been fishing for decades, centuries. My father was a fisherman, my grandfather was a fisherman, my great-grandfather was a fisherman, and I want my kids to be fishermen. And we tell them, well, your resource is going to last too long. You have to do something about it. And you're by-catching sea turtles, by the way. You're killing other species. How we do it? The way we do it is we have to wear the shoes of another discipline or another community, and it's bottom-up. How we involve the local community, the local governments, the local entities in this process. And that's the most difficult part. So my purpose here is to begin collapsing barriers established by disciplinary silos, really. This is the only objective of this launching of our transdisciplinary research, academic and scientific approach to problems. And I want undergrads, graduate students, postdocs, and all faculty be involved in ways that they can. It's not a lot of money, it's seed money for you to begin thinking about problems. We're still figuring out, shall we support all entities, all groups that are already connected, or shall we create new relationships? I think both are valid. Probably new connections will be getting more points because that's great, but it's going to take time to elaborate. All connections may already have reached the level they want to, but they need a little bump to get to the next level. Of course we're going to embrace. So I'm just going to say it's my distinct pleasure to introduce, come on Bruce, my good friend. Unfortunately, he started at 8 a.m. Bruce Wilcox. Bruce has a very interesting career. He actually co-founded the field of consortium biology. But I'm not behind. I co-founded the field of consortium medicine because consortium biology failed, and consortium medicine failed too. And planetary health, and eco-health, and all that. Yeah. So there's a lot of fields created. We worked together and launched the EcoHealth Journal and the International Society for
Ecology and Health.
Yeah. So we worked together for about 20 years trying to dig into this transdisciplinary concept that's so complicated and hard to get into. And still to date, I can count with my right hand number of transdisciplinary projects across the planet. It's very few and really hard to accomplish. So I don't expect you to get into the transdisciplinary mode with $25K or $50,000. Not a lot of money. But I want you to begin breaking down the disciplinary silos to integrate with others and hopefully begin solving our wicked problems. And what's wicked problems? Problems that we cannot solve in traditional ways. Interestingly, natural resources, we have a few. In fact, every single natural resource problem is a wicked problem. And so we have a real opportunity to do that. I was approached by several colleges already if their wicked problem would be part of it, and I said, well, cow euthanasia may not work here, or animal behavior not work here, because we want PIs to be from Warner just because the funding is coming from the college. However, you are welcome to invite anybody outside that. Anyway, Bruce's career has been very interesting. He got, I'm going to have to read some of this because I already told you he was chief officer of the International Association of Ecology and Health. He started his academic degree as a pre-med, and then a lab and field biology student, and received his undergrad education from the University of California, San Diego, I believe, with a BA in biology. And that's a question we had yesterday with the provost and dean's office. BA, BS, shall we involve BA in STEM? Shall we not? It is crazy the way things are going. And I think BA and BS should be qualified the same level. Anyway, I'm sidetracking, but that's okay. And then MS in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of California, from Yale University. And then he did a traineeship with NIH and got a PhD in population biology from Yale and UC San Diego. So it was actually a cross-disciplinary program. Then he became associate professor, co-founded consortium biology, and taught about human biology program at Stanford, led international sustainability consulting in the 90s, and from 2001 and 2011 was chair of ecology and health at the University of Hawaii, a brand new set up position, but that links health and ecology. That was unheard of. And also private ownership in Hawaii, because I spent 3 years there trying to instill conservation and health with monk seals and sea turtles, and nobody will get it. So we kind of overlap a lot for our careers. And today he focuses in transdisciplinarity, ecosystem-based methods, health and sustainability, and a big part of his time has been in zoonotic disease control focus with vector-borne diseases. So it is a real pleasure to introduce Bruce, and hopefully you have a little understanding of where we want to go with this. Thank you.
Thank you. They have to turn this off.
The mic is not working, so you don't have to use that.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah, now.
Yeah, I'm pleased to be here. And, that's pretty bright. Yeah, so I had no idea what I was coming here to see. I had been through, it'd been decades since I've been through Fort Collins, and so far I've met a number of faculty and students, and it's really been a pleasure. I think there are more people who actually are interested and understand this and grasp this than almost any place I've ever been, really. And so I was going to retire, but then I was down in Texas working on my Jeep. I used to be an auto mechanic, and it was really important to know that, because before I went to college, I was a naturalist. In order to get to these places, I needed to work on a Jeep. I had transportation, right? And so, you know, I was poor. I lived in a rural area in Southern California, in the Mojave Desert area. And so I lived in a town that was full of backyard mechanics, including one of my classmates' brother actually raced and won the Baja 1000 the first time with Parnelli Jones, the famous legendary race car driver. So I was actually an auto mechanic, and I was trained and was a professional mechanic and licensed in California. But I thought, that was about 21, I thought, well, I can't do this forever. Besides, I was really concerned about what I was seeing in the mountains, the destruction going on and so on. So I thought I should have credentials, but I had no interest in academia. I still have no interest in academia. And I would bring up the car thing because, well, once I kind of semi-retired, am I? It's not.
The mic. You're okay.
I recalled that the nice thing about working on cars is that it's you can't really fake it. You know, if the car is broken, you have to know something about automotive, you know, mechanisms and so on. And when I worked in San Diego at one of the top Porsche Volkswagen dealers, my service advisor was a German. He'd flown with the Luftwaffe and the Nazis. And when you screwed up on a car, you would know about it, you know. So, and you can't fake it. Like in academia, you can fake it. You can say, well, you know, no, you can't fake it. Either fixed it or you didn't, right? And so I always really, that really struck me, because when I went into academia, a lot of wonderful people, but a lot of people who cheat quite a bit too, I hate to say. But anyway, let me again thank you for coming and tolerating both of us, I guess. I think, let me say this about transdisciplinarity. It reminded me of a video I saw of Richard Feynman. Some of you may know he was a famous physicist and wonderful teacher at Caltech, and he wrote these notes that everybody uses to learn physics and stuff. But there's a video where you can watch him saying that he was a Nobel laureate, but he hated getting a Nobel Prize because it just diverted him from what he wanted to do, which is solve problems. He didn't like that. And in fact, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences and declined. He said, well, I wouldn't want to belong to an organization whose main function is deciding who can belong to the organization. I know 2 other people who did that too. Try to go through what I know. So I'm just sharing you my experiences from many, many years at work. So what I wanted to do, I thought after talking to some of our colleagues here, that it would be good to try to articulate what is transdisciplinary in the very beginning. I'll go back to it again in the end after I talk about a lot of my personal experiences in history and what I learned. But so I'm not going to read all of this, but you can read it with me sort of a little bit. But so the difference, so we have to differentiate and remind ourselves basic research versus, applied research versus transdisciplinary research. So that's what I wanted to start with. So one of the things I wanted to say to you was I was at a meeting in Japan a couple of years ago, just for the fun of it, and there was a group of successful scientists in front, two of whom had Nobel Prizes. One was a molecular biologist, one was a guy named Leo Isaki, and he invented the Isaki diode. And he had to stop everybody during the discussion. He said, wait a second, we have to remember now that science is about understanding how nature works. Nature works, okay? And technology, and I could go for anything, any methodology you might use in forestry or wildlife management, anything, is the application of that knowledge of how nature works. So how nature works is continually, that understanding is continually evolving, but that's basic science. And what in inventing this diode, the diode is like, it's on a chip, and you have to dope the chip just like other, microprocessors and so on. And he had to turn to Schrodinger's wave equation, which even Schrodinger didn't understand, in order to realize, well, I need to put more dope on this on the machinery to laying silicon and then doping it and so on, because you're dealing with an unbelievable phenomenon of a solid object moving through another solid object. In other words, it's called quantum tunneling or electron tunneling. And this actually, it doesn't make any sense. How can this happen? But anyway, so he turned to the equations and realized, well, seems like I might have to add a little more doping agent. And so that was the relationship. And so I want us to think about that. That's what we all do, really. And all of us here are interested in solving real problems out there with wildlife management and so on, but it's based on our understanding of basic how nature works, how wildlife populations work, and that kind of thing. So that was really valuable for me to think about. So here we go. I think you can read this. The important thing here is to point out the work of Kuhn. Some of you may know Thomas Kuhn, who wrote not personally necessarily, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. If you don't know that, especially students, you really should read it, because it tells you how science actually works. And so what Kuhn did was, he pointed out, he had another book called The Copernican Revolution. And in my lifetime, there was a major scientific revolution, major, like when I was in high school, it was still believed that continental drift was not believed in, because the guy who proposed it 50 years before was thought to be a nutcase, right? And then it was discovered that, yes, continental drift does happen, and there are tectonic plates, and that just changed everything. It changed how you think about, frame, define everything about geophysics, right? And those are two examples, the heliocentric and geocentric situation with the Copernican revolution and what I just mentioned. But there are many smaller examples, and I think we're going through one right now with complexity. I think that's what the basis of all this is about, I think. So anyway, so it's the idea, paradigm is the idea of applying particular frames of thought, theory, models, skills, and so on. And they have boundaries, right? They have boundaries around them, and academics police the boundaries. You can't go outside that boundary. If you see something, observe something that doesn't fit within those boundaries, often it's just excluded until enough evidence is accumulated and you can't ignore it anymore. And so then you, hopefully, when enough people die who are clinging to the paradigm, then you shift. Society shifts, science shifts. So we talked about this already. So basic and applied behaviors can be disciplinary or interdisciplinary. That means combining two different the models and theories and so on of two disciplines to come up with new ideas, new theories and concepts and practice and so on. So in the case of transdisciplinarity, or we can call it either TD or TDR, it addresses a real-life problem, and by that I mean a problem that matters to society in general, not just to academics. And so in science, we're worried about solving, in our discipline, we're worried about solving a problem concerning how nature works, right? Not how to apply that. As well as, but in Transdisciplinary, we're interested in the broader issue of some bigger problem, say like loss of biodiversity, which of course involves not just scientists, but all the, quote, stakeholders, unquote, who may be involved and are important in this. And so, and that can include outside of so-called formal science. So anyway, I hope this is helpful. I'm going to talk more later about how we do it, but I think we can start with this. And I'm happy to anybody, I just put this together today based on talking to people and what I already knew, because I thought we should start with this, and it's going to be important to the program. There are many references, but this is a fairly important book, the handbook. That came out a while ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Is there a date there?
Yeah, 2008.
Yeah, okay. Whatever. Anyway, you can Google those. So to summarize, a scientific problem is a puzzle scientists seek to solve that will advance knowledge within a specific discipline. It is basically carried out in a laboratory or by experiment using disciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches and with the constraint within the paradigms. A real-life problem is a difficulty or trouble faced by society or some segment of society involving a complex adaptive system. So this is really the big change that's taken place. I don't talk about it here, but I just will briefly mention that some of you may recall that Simon Levin, probably one of the most eminent ecologists alive at Princeton, alive in general, but he's at Princeton now in emeritus, I think. He wrote a book called Fragile Dominion in '98, I believe, and a couple of papers, one in ecosystems and one in bioscience, pointing out that, look, after all these years, we thought ecosystems were more or less equilibrium systems. They're not. They're far from equilibrium. They're complex. Both physicists and theoretical ecologists call complex adaptive systems. And they break all the rules about how we really think about systems. And this is true of all living systems, the climate system, ecosystems, social systems, everything. That is, now the human body is not a complex adaptive system, because it's not self-organized. It develops according to a blueprint, right? So we're talking about self-organizing, non-equilibrium, far from equilibrium, in fact, systems that have emerging properties that actually cannot be understood on the basis of just understanding the parts. Okay, so one of the things we won't have time to talk about it here, but really there isn't a solution in transdisciplinarity. The solution is the process of bringing people together to realize there isn't a simple or one solution. There may be several solutions, and those solutions may change over time because the system's always changing. But what's important is that local science, there's a book here by Silito, which is worth looking at, global versus local knowledge, which really includes indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, as well as local knowledge, any knowledge that is held by a people that is passed on culturally based on where they live and their understanding of the land and the resources and so on. And you all know about this more than I do, probably. So I think what we're going to talk about, what we need to be worried about, I think, actually, is this, TDR can apply to many, many, many different things. It could not necessarily just the area of natural resources, but we're concerned about that, obviously. So I just written this down. So this is really the kind of thing we're concerned about, and maybe the major issues. And overall, I think the overarching issue is basically sustainability, because all of these things, sustainability requires addressing all of these things and in more detail, these kinds of things. And I think you all know this, but I'm just writing it down, that's all, so that you can make use of it, hopefully. So now I'm going to talk about some personal experiences, share with you things I've never shared actually in public. And it's when I discovered about these silos and gaps and when I tried to do something about it. Excuse me. So bear with me here, and then I'll go through this, and then I'll end with going back to, well, how do you do transdisciplinarity, just briefly, and what some of the things I've been involved in that seem to be kind of working. This is Exhibit 1. Does anybody recognize this? Anybody recognize this?
Wintertime.
Wintertime. You got it. There are a couple of people here that went to Yale Forestry School. Anybody in this room? Okay, so on the left is Sage Hall. It's the first natural resource management school in the U.S. It was founded by Gifford Pinchot, who was kind of a colleague of Teddy Roosevelt. And it was where Aldo Leopold studied, and many other people. I studied there a little bit. And on the right is Osborne Memorial Laboratory. And it was many things, but it was mainly where zoology was years ago. But when I was there, it was the program in the ecology and evolutionary biology. And on the big tall building here is called Klein Tower. And it was molecular biology and biochemistry. And then behind this building over here is Peabody Museum, which is where the paleontologists, systematists, and taxonomists are, and stuff like that. And so when I went there, I had an office in this building, maybe read about there, I don't know. Coincidentally, a lot of this is just totally chance. So coincidentally, my roommate, my office mate, was a guy named Bob Pyle, Robert Michael Pyle. Anybody heard of him? Yeah. So he and I were close friends. We were nodding back there. He's kind of a well-known nature writer now, and the movie was made about one of his experiences. Did you see the movie about Bigfoot? Yeah. Not such a good movie, but anyway, at least it's about him. Anyway, I learned a lot from him about what was going on in Europe with regards to conservation at the time, because he came back from a Fulbright fellowship, and he had met all kinds of people and worked with them. He was setting up something called the Xerxes Society. Anybody heard of that? It's an insect conservation society. And he had so many interesting friends, from Sir Peter Scott, Miriam Rothschild, whom I met, and his people I met were, it's unbelievable. Miriam Rothschild, who, she was actually part of that project that was breaking the code during World War II, the German code. Right. Her husband was a commando in the Polish commando, and I met these people. It's amazing. And of course, she was a key person in understanding the research developing the relationship between insect-plant interactions and secondary metabolism issues with plants and so on. Anyway, so I had an office in there with him, and I learned about, I was in this program over here. He was more of a naturalist, so he didn't go through the crazy stuff I went through. And when you talk about BA and BS, at UCSD, I had 3 years of chemistry and got a BA, and physics and physical biochemistry, on and on and on. And I got a BA. That's a BA. I mean, anyway. So here we have, the interesting thing was, I thought that there must be some movement between all these places, but there wasn't. I mean, the students kind of did. I took a course over in geology attached to Peabody. Peabody is the beautiful mural of the dinosaurs. If you've seen that by Rudolph Zallinger, that's there. But it still has unopened boxes that O.C. Marsh had collected dinosaurs in the late 19th century. He was fighting with Cope in Philadelphia, the Academy of Sciences. They were in this match to see who could find the most. And one of them would go and find this depository of dinosaur bones, and they'd blow it up so the other one came and couldn't get it. But there were still unopened boxes from O.C. Marsh in the basement of Peabody. And so anyway, Bob enticed me to go walk here. I mean, actually, I lived up the street. So this is Prospect Street, by the way. I think this is church over here. And I walked over here, and I took a course with him and others, and they actually used Odom's ecology textbook. But no one in this building would even get near Odom ecology textbook. Was that soft science? I mean, that's not theoretical population biology. Anyway, so I snuck over there and took that course. And so I just wanted to show you, that's my first. Okay, now here's a bigger picture. So basically, this is New Haven. That's the Klein building. That's UC San Diego. I was an undergraduate here, and then I went back actually to get my PhD because it was just too cold here. And I wanted to work at Baja. But, this is an amazing place. It has Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And interestingly, I was just thinking about it today, I was maybe the third or fourth graduated class from UCSD, because although Scripps had been a field station for Berkeley since the turn of the century or something, it only really started about 4 years before, and they graduated its first core class about 4 years before, 3 years before I did, whereas Yale graduated first class about 400 years ago. So what does that tell you? I mean, talk about tradition. So the tradition was very strong at Yale. It was totally different. And I bring this up because I'll talk more about how this meeting came about, but we couldn't have done this meeting at Yale because, people would have thought, well, it ought to be in the forestry school, not in biological sciences or ecology and evolution, where people would be fighting about where to have it. And there isn't such a division at UCSD because there was no department of ecology or anything. It was just, things were all mixed up. It was the same building that the people who were chemists interact with biochemists, interact with molecular biologists, who interact with population genetic. Everyone was kind of mixed up, and so it was much more loose, And when you went into the office at Yale to talk to your professor, he sat behind the desk. He had a bow tie and a tweed jacket, right? When you went to talk to a professor here, they had their surfboard in the back of the office, and and they wore flip flops or something like that. So it was really, the culture was different, and we could not have had this meeting. I think now, here, we would have had to have it here because of various reasons. So that's my first experience. And I was a young graduate student. I thought, well, what is this crazy, So let me see what I have next. How did this meeting come about? Well, let me go back. The meeting came about because when I went back to San Diego to finish my PhD, UC system had a annual retreat up in the mountains, and a few faculty from the UC system were interested in population biology and evolution, ecology, and so on, would go, and then a few students. There weren't that many people, maybe 20 or 30. And I got to know Jared Diamond quite well, who some of you know who he is. He wasn't who he is now. He was a membrane physiologist at the UCLA Medical School, quite prominent, was already a member of the National Academy at age 39 doing that, but his hobby was ornithology, and he got money from National Geographic to go to the Southwest Pacific. He learned the language in about 2 weeks of the local populations, and then started collecting data on what birds were there. So he did some really interesting work on island biogeography. He had been a friend of, I'll show you in a second, Robert MacArthur, and so he was interested in that whole area. I'll show you that in a second. So what's remarkable and really fortunate for me is these are the people I actually interacted and had discussions with these people. And so they were all Renaissance biologists. Why would Linus Pauling be in that set? Because it turns out that when he was at Caltech, so was Dobzhansky. And they're from entirely different background, but they would sit in the same conferences, and it turns out that it was Pauling who suggested the idea of crossover, they were seeing these anomalies in the Drosophila genes. And it didn't matter whether you were a chemist. Of course, Linus Pauling he's the only person to have 2 unshared Nobel Prizes. The main one was in protein synthesis or something, but what he did basically, I don't exactly recall, but he basically discovered and explained the chemical bond. I mean, how more basic can it be than that, the chemical bond? But he had been a postdoc with all these guys I think in the 40s. Some of them had been, the professor he had in Germany at the postdoc had produced 17 Nobel laureates, And so he was a brilliant man. And so he came and taught several weeks in my chemistry class, and I actually, by accident, had some conversations with him. These people had no egos. It was unbelievable. And so I had a chance to interact with him, and I was closest to him because Hutchinson, who you may know is basically the father of modern ecology, he produced tons of students who basically are the leading ecologists, had been in that period of time. So this was the golden age of biology in the U.S., above the molecular level. I spent weeks with Ernst Mayr chatting about things and having quite an interesting time with him. Took him bird watching, and I had discussions with Dobzhansky. So all these people were tremendously inspiring to me. But I say probably especially Hutchinson. He was such a kind and gentle man. And if you went in to meet him and talk about your project, he would ask you one question and you'd be dumbfounded, and then you'd walk out and you wouldn't have to see him for another month because you'd be struggling with that question for a month. When I was there, he was finishing the last volume of the treatise on limnology, 4 volumes. All of them are like 400 pages thick, covering physics, chemistry, mycology, biochemistry, everything. So he was truly a transdisciplinary guy. People were all transdisciplinary. In fact, second Nobel Prize for working on the program for arms control, nuclear arms control. So he had this ethical, social concern, which kind of made him transdisciplinary. But anyway, I was inspired. All these people did not stop reading at their narrow discipline. They kept going, and so this was just natural to think this way. So what happened was, one of the students, as I mentioned, of Hutchinson was, I was going to mention Robert MacArthur. You probably don't know him. You probably know Ed Wilson, who just passed away last year. Know of him. I know Ed Wilson. I knew him. I didn't know him because he died of cancer at age 42. Out of Hutchinson's lab came not only MacArthur, but Raymond Lindemann, who did the minor thing of discovering the trophic dynamic concept, which couldn't get published. He got in a car wreck, and Hutch, who we called him, he actually got the manuscript finished and finally got it published. But can you imagine ecology or ecosystem thinking without the trophic pyramid and so on? And that came out of the lab. But MacArthur was clearly very reductionistic. He made major contributions, as some of you know, to population ecology. He was an ornithologist, he was a bird watcher, but he was a mathematician. He combined those, and he was a friend of Jared Diamond's, and so they did things together in the 60s and early 70s, I guess, but then he passed away. But what I did was this book changed everything because while neither of these individuals were interested in conservation, they were basic scientists, this was in the preface to their book. They meant the same principles of island biogeography will apply to this whole business of basically habitat fragmentation. So it was very prescient. And when I picked up that book, this was the first in the series, population biology series out of Princeton. And that thing just stuck in my mind. I couldn't believe it. And so I thought it was so interesting. So one of the things I did was I was working in the field in Baja, and I collected data on vertebrate species distributions. And Jared Diamond has shown in a PNAS project, a study in PNAS publication, that islands in Southwest Pacific were perhaps supersaturated with birds, the ones that were land-bridge islands, because they were younger, right? So I thought, well, I can even get more direct evidence if I have dates for islands in the Sea of Cortez, our home. And so we used lizards because lizards go extinct slowly, and we were able to show, I was still a graduate student, and I had this paper in Science. The title of it is Supersaturated Island Fauna as a Species-Area Relationship for Lizards on Post-Pleistocene Land-bridge Islands. So basically, it was the first evidence to show that, yes, when you contract habitat area, you instigate a faunal collapse. And so it was the first evidence for that. 6 or 7 or 8 years later, it was a big debate, you may recall. Remember the sloss debate? You all remember anything about the single large? Well, there were antagonists of myself and Diamond and others saying, oh, there's no proof that subdividing habitats causes increasing extinction rates. In fact, at that time, people didn't even think about extinction as an ecological process. It was a paleontological phenomenon, with the exception of maybe the dodo or something. So Diamond had been working on this, showing that, trying to demonstrate that, yes, extinction happens routinely in local demographic units and so on and so on. So basically, what I did was I learned from him, did this paper, and then that even inspired me more to get involved in conservation, because it suggested that we're going to see huge collapses everywhere as we fragment land and the predatory areas become isolated. And Soleil and I and a student wrote this paper using this same model for East African reserves, showing that how the reserves would lose mammal species over time. So that was the beginning of kind of getting, this was actually just a basic science. This was applied science. This was published in the journal Biological Conservation. There was no conservation biology, except for a paper that had been published a few years before in a book by Duffy and Watt on biological conservation based on a meeting in England, where a guy named Norman Moore had been working on the heaths of Dorset and had pointed out in his studies of lizards and butterflies that clearly demographic and genetic factors were involved in the loss of those species. So the whole idea of conservation biology basically was to bring this into conservation, but it's very reductionistic, right? So I asked Jared what we should do to bring these two buildings together, and he said, well, he said, well, have a conference, And so I went to Tom Lovejoy, and he said, well, this is a good idea. If you can pull it off, I'll give you some money. So I came back and talked to Soleil, and we put this conference together. We decided to call it conservation biology because he'd been working on conservation genetics, and we're not going to limit it to genetics, but of small populations, things like that, but add ecology. So I won't go into great detail, but that's what led to the meeting. And this was the two papers that kind of prompted us. Soleil generally was working in genetics, but we did this more of an ecology, autobiography paper together showing how these, I was looking at, the East African reserves would collapse over time in terms of species numbers. So everybody's familiar with species-area relationships and so on. But behind this is what? It's the equilibrium theory of autobiogeography, which meant that species were turning over through immigration and extinction, right? And that was a big thing for anybody to accept. And in fact, there were, as I said, there were antagonists of this for a number of years, Daniel Simbeloff and others, who said, well, you faked your data. Or in fact, Diamond and Gilpin, one of my advisors, had to redo all the data and show that no, the results are real. And so anyway, but I think in the end we won, and that yes, habitat fragmentation is a major component of species loss. So anyway, the other thing which was really important and happened at this time, the genetic part, so the big things that happened was the synthesis, I think exemplified by the autobiography, the book and so on, but the other was this so-called modern synthesis in which several people above, Dobzhansky, Meyer, these guys, Ronald Fisher. Fisher is one of the inventors of modern statistics. Haldane and Sewell Wright. Sewell Wright was at the University of Chicago and actually an animal breeding geneticist. And a few other people basically were the architects of the modern evolutionary theory, basically showing how Darwinian evolution actually works. And so these two things were huge, and this just had come about in the 60s and 70s. So it was the latter part of the last century where all this stuff came together. And so this again was a case of interdisciplinary, not transdisciplinary, where these guys had basically laid the foundation to bridge experimental genetics, natural history, and paleontology, for example. So this kind of thing went on frequently, but there's two huge examples that I've just shown you. The MacArthur and Wilson was basically sort of an integration of population genetics and paleontology and so on and so forth. Most of it was about populational thinking, a term that Ernst Mayr used a lot. Even though some of his community ecology was populational, he called it that, populational thinking, because the population is the subject of selection, right? So anyway, so this happened in 1980, this book, and it got a lot of press. Some of you weren't even born, I think. And then I was myself and two other people started the journal. Mike Soleil was essential in getting this whole thing going. He spent years getting us all together, and David Ehrenfeld was the editor-in-chief. I was one of two associate editors. This would have been, I think this was 86. So this is a problem, basically. There existed schisms that still remain between population and ecosystems thinking, or populational thinking, and CB originally excluded the latter. We didn't have anybody in that book who was an ecosystem ecologist. It was crazy. And then the human dimension was often not there. Kevin and I talked about this yesterday. And meanwhile, ecosystem management and this understanding of ecosystems as complex, coupled human natural systems, leading ultimately to this social ecological systems framework, the Holling School basically, was running in parallel. They were just not there's no interaction between these two things. What I don't mention here is there still is a schism going on today. I was talking to, some of you may know who David Western is from Kenya. He's written a number of books. He was at that meeting. I'm still in touch with him. We still interact. That's 40 years or more later. And he had Michael Soleil come up to him about 6 years ago before Michael passed, literally attacking him, saying, how can you have communities involved in conservation? There's this purist view Same with, Paul and Earl came up to him and were worried really terribly that David was always in this idea that, David had a long history of working with the Maasai in Africa in the national parks and on the boundaries of the parks and so on. But Mike and Paul and Ann could not understand the idea that somehow people should be involved and considered in conservation biological diversity. It's just the way they thought, right? And this schism still exists today. So let me remind you that it was in 1935 that the concept was first introduced by Tansley. And, this is what he called it. It was actually a critique of somebody who had written the paper. Phillips was his name, in South Africa, who had gotten, he felt it wrong, who was moving things in the wrong direction in terms of understanding vegetation complexes and maybe leading people to believe in sort of an organismal, ethereal kind of notion of ecosystem that wasn't scientific enough. So he wrote this paper, and then that's the end of it. So this was in 35, of course. So even ecology, the name was introduced in 1869, right? So this is a long time to even get to this point. But it was really this person, Gene Odom, and his brother, Howard, who was a student of Hutchinson. And Gene would stay in touch with Howard. This is about 1950 in his work. And Howard was experimenting with using systems modeling to understand ecosystems, using the same kind of diagrams and symbols used in electrical circuitry and so on. And as you may know, Howard Odom worked for years and did really interesting work in this area. But Gene was challenged by, he goes, a new assistant professor in zoology. There was no field of ecology. At Georgia, and his colleagues were saying, well, what's ecology? There's no principles. What is it? And so he's going to prove to him that there were fundamentals. And so that was the book that came out first in 53, and the major theme was ecosystems, and Howard, maybe was a co-author, I'm not sure, but helped him with that. So this is the latest edition. Gene obviously passed away about 10 years ago. And it's a wonderful book. I think it's probably more people learn ecology from this book than anybody, any other book. And so the key thing that I got from it was this relationship, this hierarchical relationship between these components of the ecosphere. And I remember that from the textbook because I would use the textbook. If I hadn't gone up to the forestry school, I wouldn't have taken that class with Herb Borman that used this book. I wouldn't have known it. And so basically, what happened, though, was this all led to a definition of biological diversity, which I'm going to confide in you, that is seriously flawed. And I wrote the definition. And also the critique by George Woodwell, who many of you know is probably the most highly respected forest ecologist alive. He called the biodiversity blunder. So I want to talk about that because there's an obvious opportunity here for us and anybody who's interested. So how did this come about? Well, basically what happened was in the 70s, the MAB program was a big deal. Everyone was interested and people were involved all over the world. Even Odoms were involved. And the idea was that this model of the Biosphere Reserve, which came out of one of the projects in the MAB and Biosphere program called the Conservation of Natural Areas and the Genetic Diversity they contain. Serrato Franco, the geneticist, was on that committee, who Mike Soule knew, and I had met several times. So the idea was that we really needed to save what was going to be left, because we could see that very rapidly things were being destroyed around the world, particularly in the tropics. And it wasn't just a matter of species, it was their genetic diversity, and there were genetic resources that were important to agriculture and forestry and so on. So that was this project, which Ray and Otto were involved in, led to this model. You've seen that before, I'm sure. But what happened then was, well, if you have, this would allow us to then make sure we were situating enough of these in enough places in the world to sample they didn't call it biodiversity, sample the natural areas and the genetic diversity. So what happened was I was asked by IUCN to write a chapter on applying conservation biology to that problem. And it prompted me to think, well, I have to give an operational definition of biological diversity. And in that chapter, I wrote that chapter, and in the next chapter, Ray wrote a chapter in which he defined ecosystem people, and he said, well, the real problem here is, what about all these people that are living in these protected areas? That needs to be addressed. But this seems to have been forgotten in conservation biology. And ironically, it was right after my chapter. So it was the 1980, I had to come up with this definition in 82, and it was published in 84. And so this whole thing prompted the need to define biological diversity. And so I was sitting with Ray Dasman, and I said, Ray, here's an idea. And so I wrote down this definition. We were in a meeting in Washington, D.C., and he said, yeah, that's what I meant. And then I presented this in Georgia, at Athens, at a little workshop, and Gene Odom was in the workshop, and he liked it. He put it in his book. And so really, I didn't invent this. I just was the one who articulated it because they asked me to write something up. And I attempted to articulate what Ray, who had first used the term in a book 10 years before or more, and Gene Odom obviously was thinking about it. And so I simply put it in writing, and it was published in that volume we just saw. But the thing I want to make clear is that this definition was for a particular narrow purpose. It was for inventory, basically. It wasn't about how do you take these concepts and work with local people and in a participatory way to protect variety and variability. It was not for that purpose. It was a social construct based on these needs. And I don't think too many people realize that. But George understood it. And George said this, sorry for the two F's there, but he said, biodiversity, or biotic diversity, he liked that word, emerged as a catch term. It did, it became a catch term. When it was shortened, I think that's sort of unfortunate. Attractive concept, but described everything and nothing, offered no implement, no tool, no model. It provided no example of success nor clear cost of failure. It was not easily defined, measured, or conserved. He had a slightly different view of it. He had his biotic diversity view. And I'm not sure I completely agree, but there's a lot of what he's saying here I think that's correct. The logic refuted ignored a century of analysis by botanists who saw plant and animal communities as no less a product of evolution, mutual dependencies, structural complementarities. He was really getting at the reductionistic definition that we came up with, and everything that was reductionistic in population community ecology. We scientists and conservators of life and environment have been engaged in perpetuating a monstrous, unnecessary, and possibly fatal blunder. So anyway, look at what Darwin said. I mean, clearly this was the definition that we'd come up with for biological diversity was at odds with even what Darwin wrote, right? So I won't read this. You've seen these words before, probably. So what have we done here? Can that definition of Darwin's description of the tangled bank, can that be reduced to numbers of and differences among taxa and commodified in terms of human well-being and the ecosystem services? Do you think so? This is just, as you can see, just a table I put in there describing what I just said, basically. So here's some critiques of rather important exploring the connections among nature, ecosystem service, human health and well-being up. So this, really, I find this, frankly, paper kind of bogus because they misunderstand biodiversity. They narrowly, reductionistly defined it. Dick Norgard of Berkeley wrote an amazing paper, which is quite deep. Ecosystem services, from eye-opening metaphor to complexity blinder. And so you can get the paper and read it, but that really, it confirmed what I had already been thinking. And anyway, there was this state-of-the-art volume produced a few years ago dealing with not only biodiversity and human health, but I think it's extremely limited, if not flawed, and I'll tell you why for these reasons. Serious challenges based on the failure to consider social and political processes, lack of inclusivity, which have been claimed among leading female conservation scientists, a claim of overall failure of the biodiversity imperative program, on and on and on. So here's some papers biodiversity blender, but the quote area is from this paper that was in, I think, Bioscience, and 2000 something. And then this paper that was a comment, which was about the lack of inclusivity, and another paper about the lack of, understanding of the social-political issues related to biodiversity. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. So the other thing that I really considered was, often who are the stakeholders in biodiversity? It's not just us academics pontificating about the terrible thing that is occurring with losing biodiversity. When I was at Stanford, which is fairly, some people can be pretty arrogant there, it was like, well, we have to get the people away from nature so they don't destroy it, and rather than working with them, right? But now looking back, there are at least this list of stakeholders, right? And probably the most important one is down here. And I spent a lot of time in the tropics, and there's about 2 or 3 billion people that live in the surroundings of these protected areas, right? And those are the people who are basically the de facto conservators of biodiversity, not us sitting in an academic institution. And no attention has been given to that. In fact, the thought was, when I was at Stanford, was, these people are destroying the forests. Well, they don't have much alternative, but they're not the ones really destroying the forests. As you know, it's the large timber companies and so on. But what I find so clear, because I actually live in an area of local farmers and forests and wildlife and so on, and I can see this. They're very knowledgeable about. They make a living. They know what variability variety is. They know what the ecosystem services are, because if they don't, they're not going to survive. And so I think that's where we really missed out, and that's part of the complexity challenge. And that's part of what Dick Margo was getting to, but his paper is really dense theoretically. So, okay, every time I have one of these guys up here, I'm going to a new set of ideas. And so basically what I've come up with here is that this discourse, the biodiversity and the health, and together has involved very little acknowledgement of this impending paradigm shift in dealing with and understanding that living systems are complex adaptive systems. And so this represents a really big challenge, but a huge opportunity for people like us. I just wanted this. So complexity is largely, I was a professor in a medical school for 10 years. This stuff is completely, we're still basing medicine on Newtonian classical physics, mechanistic kinds of processes and structures and so on. So going all the way back to his Systema Naturae, nature is considered a clockwork. And of course, he did really some great work, basically helping reinvent calculus, which I understand was actually first invented by Vedic mathematicians, but he came up with a lot of ideas in the West. And the idea being that nature is just an elegant, ingenious, majestic clockwork, whether you're talking about the planetary system or the atom, right? But in fact, modern biochemistry, molecular biology, physiology, so on, all based on this thinking. This is why we have allopathic medicine, and kind of works sometimes, not all the time. So, but yet, in spite of this, it's widely accepted, even though we use that kind of thinking, that that philosophy has been overturned by relativity, quantum physics, complexity theory. A name that a person very important in general systems theory during the 40s, 50s, and 60s is Ludwig von Bertalanffy and Ilya Prigogine. I'll talk a little more about him. And then, of course, mainly Bohr, Schrödinger, and Heisenberg. Quantum physics was so troubling for Einstein, he didn't even like it. But the fact is that it does explain nature, even though we don't understand it. It explains it. The observations we take when we do an experiment can only be explained by these very funny processes that only can be explained by the quantum mechanic descriptions and so on. There's an element of the issue of consciousness here that I obviously don't have time to get into, but So when I was at UCSD, just before planning and getting that conference going, I found this book in the bookstore. And I thought, what the heck? Evolution and Consciousness, Human Systems and Transition. So I thought, well, what is this? And the second author, the first author who was Eric Jantz, who was the one who picked up what Jean Piaget had coined and suggested the whole idea of transdisciplinarity in the early 70s. And it was Jantz who picked it up and went with it. He was a theoretical physicist. I didn't know him, but at that time I knew Waddington because he was a geneticist, and Dobzhansky wrote about him, and everybody knew him. Weyer knew him. He did developmental genetics at the University of Edinburgh, but he was another Renaissance biologist. He'd been a geologist and then became a geneticist. He's an amazing guy. This book, I'm still trying to understand it after 40 years. But what it did was I read it, I saw it, and I started reading. I thought, well, Holling had a chapter in here, and Prigogine, who had just gotten the Nobel Prize for showing that living systems are far from equilibrium, not equilibrium. Ecosystems are not equilibrium systems. The theory about geography, the equilibrium theory, is not really, there's no equilibrium. It's just bouncing around in a meta-stable state, so to speak. So a new way of thinking about ecosystems emerges, and it had been building ever since basically the 70s based on complex adaptive system principles, based on analytical tools that Holling and others had developed. And what Holling came up with was that ecosystems have this natural rhythm of change, the amplitude and frequency of which is determined by developmental internal processes and structures in response to external variability. Now, he shows this in all kinds of interesting graphs and illustrations. It's kind of complicated, but the whole point of this is that one has to work with these rhythms of change, not against them. Top-down control always fails, and he even used examples like mosquito control and diseases like malaria. If you spray the mosquito enough, you'll simply change the system. It'll bite you back, and the whole thing will collapse. And you all have seen probably the so-called adaptive cycle. So this began with this 1978 book, which I own all these books, and it's wonderful to read. And then Carl Walters came up a little bit longer. Buzz is his nickname, was at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis as a sabbatical for a couple of years. And I think some of his colleagues from UBC joined him, including Carl. And so they came up with this second book, and you can see the relevance of these. The idea of adaptive management is where this all came from, this work they were doing. Fascinating work. And then there were 5 or 6 other major works. And then finally, this book in 2002, which is about the time I met both Carl and Buzz. I'd asked them to help me with a project, or advised me on a project of developing the management plan for the Northwest Rhode Island thing, that there were the huge national marine sanctuary that was being created. Our group led the NEPA compliance, executive order, interpretation, management plan. And so I've been in touch with Carl and Buzz. And then a year later, and then this book, which is a wonderful book, you may have seen this book by Volker Brooks, Colin and Carl Folk. Those are fantastic books. I urge everyone to get them. There are others in between, such as Barriers and Bridges to Ecosystem Sustainability, which is an excellent book. But these really changed everything. And they're based on the whole idea of complexity. And they don't use the word transdisciplinary, but it's inherent in most of these things. So out of this work comes this, I guess I would say, a revolution of insights, practical insights. This is a summary paper in Global Environmental Change by Carl Folke on all these insights. And here they are, that how human systems learn, human natural systems learn, visioning and scenario building, leadership, agents and actors. So there's a huge amount of literature on this and a lot of review papers that pull all this together. It's very difficult, but it's very meaningful. largely centered on the concept of resilience, which has a specific meaning in complexity science. It's not the same meaning as just generally saying. Another term people use is anti-fragility, right? Have you seen, how many of you know of the book of the Black Swan? I think, am I going over? Where am I?
Actually, having,
Okay.
that was going to be over 5.
Okay.
Very good.
Okay. The Black Swan by Nassim. You've seen that book.
Yeah, they got it right.
It's a very complicated idea. He's not very accessible, but he uses the word anti-fragility instead of resilience. And basically, it's good because he's a statistician and he's basically a stock trader, basically, but a brilliant guy. And the most important thing, one of the most important things he came up with is the idea of fat tails, that complex systems data do not obey normal Gaussian distributions. And so, and he's proven that, basically, that if some of you here work on hydrology and watershed and flooding or work on anything, extreme value theory needs to replace basic probability. The idea of a central limit theorem doesn't work here. It doesn't work. And I was in a project in Myanmar just last year, and the people were saying, well, we did the power analysis on how many people we need to sample who have been infected by dengue virus, and here's how many samples we need to take. And I said, well, did your statistician, this is your Oxford University people, did your statistician assume a normal distribution or a flat tail, or what's called the extreme value theory distribution? He said, oh, what's that? We just do it the way we've always been doing it. I said, but it doesn't make any sense because this is in medical field, people who work on vector-borne diseases, they think the vector-borne disease is a medical clinical problem. And would be an ecological evolutionary problem, right? Because the transmission is going outside. It's occurring outside, but they can't get this, And then not only is it a transmission problem involving ecology and genetics and so on, it is a complex system problem. So you cannot assume normal distributions and things like this. So it's very interesting. So you can Google Nassim Taleb and see all these really interesting papers, including one he wrote just during the pandemic, showing that the past 2,000 years, the most extreme pandemics don't fit a normal distribution. They require this fat tail distribution. The point being here, in fact, Luna Leopold told me this 30 or 40 years ago, he was required, all of you know the 100-year flood thing, right? Luna told me his sidekick who was with him, Gowdy, you may have known the name Gowdy. Yeah, I met him several times. He had to come, Luna was getting trouble from Congress, and so they had to come up with something that they were comfortable with. So we'll come up with a 100-year flood thing. Meaningless, basically, because Luna said to me, there always will be a bigger flood, right? There always will be a bigger pandemic, more extreme pandemic in terms of the harm done, right? So that's what this is about. It's the degree of harm will always be greater as time goes on. And the Black Swan idea is that it will be unimaginable. And Hoeing and his students pointed out that they call this surprise, that things will happen that couldn't be anticipated. That's the nature of complexity. So anyway, this is a great paper, I would suggest. So let's end this, right, because I'm going to annoy our leader here. So it's a transdisciplinary ecological systems approach problem, right, all this is. So this is the hierarchy of research. It was described in the Tress paper 2006, which is, you can find that. So you know this already. This is etched in your memory forever now, I'm sure, okay? And this is from the Max Neef paper showing the university, right? We have all these basic sciences, we have the applied sciences, then we have these things through which we apply the applied science, and then we have these values. So the next figure will probably help you understand this. So basically, we have these 4 levels. The level of what should be done, in terms of ethics and what should be good for everybody. What is desired, what can we do, or we're capable of doing, and what exists. And so transdisciplinarity, it basically operates you're working along this continuum here. Any vertical relations, including these 4 levels, according to, I think Max Neef is the one who says this, is transdisciplinary. It is hardly straightforward. It is hard to do. After spending maybe $20 million, IDRC, the Canada International Development Research Council, funded all these projects, and this is a paper, I'm not author on this, but a bunch of other people, including, it was actually money went through for this project I was on, but there were many others, ILRI, International Livestock Research Institute. We found that we didn't know and couldn't figure out if any of them actually met the criteria of transdisciplinarity. So then we published, I had my student work on this, Carson Richter, we published this paper on what would be the criteria for transdisciplinarity in an ecosystem approach concept. And so from this, in this paper, we developed a protocol, and it looks like this. I don't have time to go through it, but it seems people seem to buy into it. It has not been criticized. It's been now widely used, and WHO is using it. We're doing a project, a fairly big project in several countries in Africa using this. The really important here was community participation every step of the way. So this is easy to find on the internet.
Bob Dean, that I was telling you about.
He's an expert on this.
Oh, no, really an expert.
Well, I don't even understand it. So the good news is we actually have been able to, in several projects, there are some successes in the sense that those colleagues we're working with in Africa, we're beginning to, as a group, understand how to frame the problem. I don't try to explain this figure, but what this figure is, it's the social ecological systems figure, the social ecological, and how nature and human dynamics and variability can work together and do work together based on traditional knowledge, in this case, the Maasai, in a way that is sustainable. It is not top down, it is working with nature rather than against nature. And so that's what this figure is trying to show. Some people here have done work in drylands. This was about drylands. It was published, when was this published? 2019, yeah. I'm not sure that, the figure's published. So anyway, we're starting to get a handle on how to think about this. And so there have been some successes. This is some work we did. And now what we're doing is we're specifically working on the project or the problem of using so-called implementation research methods to know the degree to which we're actually aligning our intervention with the transdisciplinary ecosystem approach principles and so on. Implementation research is something that's in the medical public health field, not in our, and it employs something called logic models, which are plans that include the idea of the theories of change and what you expect to happen. So you actually can come up with an actual system and plan and methodology that has metrics. You can measure what you're doing so it's repeatable or improvable. And that's never been done in the area, in any of these areas. So how do you know when something works? How do you know why it worked? How can you improve it? Unless you have, when you work in a lab, you obviously keep measurements, right? But somehow in the field, they thought it wasn't necessary. So this is what we're doing next. So thank you very much.
Okay, so we put a time limit. Bruce can go for hours topic. He has quite a historical background. But discussing with him, he wanted to give you kind of a framework of how difficult is a way to reach transdisciplinarity.